I mean, they talk about the most important people in a young person's life. It's their parents, and then it's their coach, and then it's their teacher in that order. And so that's the kind of significance of the role that you're playing with these young people who have been entrusted to you. So thinking about the culture and the environment that you're creating over the years, having coached a lot of really high performing young kids, 90% of the time it's coming from the kid. Like the kid is asking for more help, they're asking for that equipment, they're asking, for more specialized training, they want some help learning about strength or nutrition or whatever. It's rarely, the parent that's like, I shepherded my child down this pathway and therefore they're great. And when that does happen, often you get an adult performer who it's not super intrinsic. They're doing it for other reasons, because they've been pleasing their parent the whole way or whatever. So
welcome to the Training Peaks Coachcast. I'm your host, Dirk Friel. In each episode, we'll sit down with industry experts to discuss coaching methodologies, the latest research, and leading tools for endurance training. Visit trainingpeaks.com for more training and coaching resources. My guest today is Lance Watson, who has over 25 years of triathlon coaching experience. Part of his credentials include coaching an Olympic gold medalist, being a national team coach for the past 4 Olympic Games, and he has coached more than 20 Ironman winners. And maybe best of all, Lance was inducted into the Triathlon Hall of Fame. As founder of Life Sport Coaching, he works with athletes from elites to age groupers. And as it relates to today's topic of youth development, Lance is a father of 2 high-performing athletes. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Lance Watson, thanks for joining me today on the Coachcast.
Awesome to be here. Good to catch up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we caught up a bunch in Hawaii just a little while ago. That was good to do. Had a coffee there on a Leahy Drive and get all psyched up. And I get really, I come away so inspired and just like gung-ho. I've run 20 miles in the last 3 days and I'm not a runner.
Well, keep it going. Keep the fire burning. Yeah, no, I'm missing Hawaii already. I'm sure you are too.
Yeah,
nice
absolutely.
To be doing that in palm trees and warm weather and inspiring athletes everywhere of all ages.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing you don't see in Hawaii is a lot of 15-year-olds crossing the finish line, which is probably a good thing, right? And
Thank goodness, yeah.
Yeah, we're here to talk about youth development. You're certainly one of the leading experts in this field in terms of all your practical knowledge. But then you have your family experience as well, having 2 fairly elite kids. We can get into that in 2 different sports. So it'll be interesting to see, how you balance that from being, the passionate parent to the, I guess, logical coach, in terms of youth development. But then tell us about your experience at Triathlon Canada in terms of any kind of youth development practices, methodologies, thoughts around, how does Triathlon Canada go about youth development and when do they first start working with or bringing in kids for camps?
So Triathlon Canada is primarily Olympic focused. They're thinking about how they can develop young athletes to eventually be Olympians and to have expertise in a sport that it's very dynamic. There's a broad range of skills. And when you're thinking about young athletes, you're not thinking about mileage. You're not thinking about burning them out with a lot of heavy training load. You're thinking about really finding ways to keep it fun, to keep it social, to keep it engaged, and to build that skill development so that they know how to jump on and off of their bike. They know how to corner their bike really well. They can transition in and out of the water, onto the bike, off the bike, and onto the run. And that's sort of more of a Kids of Steel, Iron Kids kind of development pathway where you might have some kids who do gravitate towards triathlon from a young age and follow that pathway. For the greater part, I would say most of the kids are still coming up in swim club. They're running track and cross country at school. Maybe they're on their bike for fun. They're riding BMX, they're mountain biking, and that kind of thing, but not a lot of focus on the bike. And it's not that necessary at a young age. I've had a number of parents reach out to me over the years who, in some cases had really talented kids, and they're like, well, what do you think they should be doing? And my feedback to them is, keep swimming with your club, make sure they're not burning out, make sure they're not doing, doubles in the pool and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of kids do drop out of swimming in their teens.
Right.
And then, keep running cross country and track with your school, really focusing on speed and threshold dynamic movement and learning good run economy at a young age versus getting, into the longer events. And then, get out in the trails on your mountain bike and just goof around with your friends on the weekend. Maybe once in a while you could do a little bit of a training ride if you're going to, do your one or two kids triathlons in the summer for fun, just to learn about the sport. But primarily, if a kid trains up their running and their swimming in the long term, the cycling, 9 out of 10 kids who can run will learn to ride a bike quite well, from a cardio engine perspective eventually. So, yeah, so those are sort of the fundamentals. And then, and then there's a focus on talent ID as well, like trying to find the kids that maybe look like they have the goods. So there are time standards that are looked for, in more, 100, 200, 400 meter freestyle versus 1500, and they're looking at 800 meter, 1500 meter, maybe 3000 meter pace on the track. But nothing. We're not looking for 5K and 10K standards in those young years because kids haven't developed that endurance yet. And to
What
be
kind of
quite
age
honest,
are we talking about?
we're talking 13, 14, 15 years old.
Okay.
Typically a kid should not start to specialize until they get into their mid-teens, and that's with any sport. They should have a variety of sporting experiences. Just becoming a dynamic, versatile, all-around athlete. If your kid's playing soccer, they're building their cardio engine, right? And they're building speed.
Yeah.
And they're having fun with their friends, and they're learning to love sport. And if your kid is doing gymnastics, they're learning, spatial awareness, strength, depth perspective, balance. Those are all transferable skills that, eventually will make you a better bike rider, et cetera. So I think you find that sometimes you'll see kids who are doing quite well, maybe at age 15, 16, because they have specialized a little bit too early, and they're a little bit overtrained for their age. So they'll start doing well at an early age, but then their ceiling is not, the same as the kid who's working on, skill development, moving quickly, threshold and anaerobic capacity development at that young age. Their overall endurance ceiling, their ability to go fast for a longer period of time will be higher in the long run.
Yeah, obviously you're getting into this concept of range versus specialization, and there's
Yes.
a book by David Epstein that's called Range, and the value of this broad multidisciplinary kind of athletic background. I think one advantage to it is that you can be thrown into new experiences and kind of problem solving as well, not just the physical side, but the mental side of being able to take on new problem solving situations and kind of navigating through. Whereas triathlon, that's what it is. I mean, these three dynamic sports that, in a way, triathlon itself is range. I mean, you just mentioned it, let's dabble in the pool, maybe get on a swim team, but yet there are swim teams that sign you on as a 12-year-old and you have to be single sport. You can't miss it. You can't miss a practice. You're traveling. Very, very serious. So what are your thoughts in terms of like specializing in any one particular sport? When might you want to do that? You mentioned mid-teens, right? Up until maybe high school, being more broad.
Yeah. I mean, classically, you should be dabbling in a bunch of sports from ages 6 all the way up to 13 or 14.
Yeah.
And at that point, you might reduce to 2 or 3, that you're gravitating towards. And that's kind of a natural progression anyway. Kids will start being on travel teams. They'll start to have a few more competitions to go to or that kind of thing. So it's hard to maybe keep it up in 6 or 7 or 8 sports when you get to that age. But
Right.
still, like joining the high school basketball team or all those kinds of things are just great experiences and build skills and fitness that are transferable to other sports. And then when you get to 17 or 18, typically if you're going to be a high performer, the demands of the sport are such that you're going to have to make your choice and specialize on that sport. through your kind of later teen years.
Right.
So not having a rush to do, and I could give you all kinds of case study examples. One is Brent McMahon, who is a professional triathlete. He just raced his last Ironman Worlds at age 43 in Nice
Wow. Yeah.
recently. I started working with Brent at age 15,
Wow.
and so 27 years, 28 years.
Wow.
And when we started working together, he was doing summer swim club. He was playing water polo. He was on the soccer team.
Yeah.
He was mountain biking. So he was running cross country and track with his high school. So lots of social opportunities with his friends, lots of competitive experiences where you could learn about winning and losing, or trying your hardest and team spirit and all those great, life foundational lessons. And then, as he got older and he started competing at junior nationals and going to junior worlds and that, it required a little bit more attention and focus. And we used to joke, well, every year I have to put your stroke back together after water polo season,
Right.
whatever. But it was great because he came back fit and strong and having
Yeah.
fun. And as a result, by the way, he learned how to swim in the mosh pit, which is triathlon at that ITU or World Triathlon Series level, because he was used to contact and
Yeah.
moving through people, and what a great learning grounds for that.
So,
And
so what did that look like at age 15? Was he the fastest kid in triathlon, or was he the slowest kid in triathlon? Like, was it just a passion? How did he come to find you as a coach
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah. Well, so I met him at a triathlon British Columbia talent ID camp that we were running. He was one of a bunch of kids there, and it was obvious he was a good athlete. He was not like an outlier talent. There were kids that were faster than him at that younger age, and I think he went raced junior nationals and came sixth, which was a great result. Like really, you're like, okay, there's a kid with talent, but you also knew that he was just starting to explore the sport. He was just a versatile all-around athlete. He had a really good head for competing. He was always, calm and confident, and that was a direct result of being the captain of a soccer team, or being on the start line of or in competitions of all kinds from a young age, and that builds a certain level of sport intelligence and also just a general sense of self-assuredness, as a person and as an athlete, going into different kinds of situations. And as we all know, triathlons, one of my favorite things about the sport of triathlon is that, you're not going to the track every day or whatever. They're all swim, bike, run, but every race is different. It's the ocean or lake or hills or wind or
You
heat.
have a different problem to overcome, it seems, with every single event.
That's right. It's sport intelligence. It's making decisions on the fly. It's reading a race. It's keeping your head in the game. It's talking yourself up when it's hard. All of those things, that are just awesome life lessons.
Well, we all have our weaknesses within the sports, right? Or one sport is weaker than the other.
Sure, that's right. So there's always something to work on. Yeah, but I will say there's like you see a lot of push or sometimes fanfare around kids, trying to do more or longer at a young age, and you get some kids. Well, one of two things are going to happen. Some kids, they'll go and do the local half marathon when they're 12 or 13, right? And it's because somebody hasn't given them guidance or said, oh, maybe that's not the best thing for you to do at this age. And we could talk about growth plates and all that kind of thing, but
Yeah.
all that aside, just as far as development. So, the kid is either going to go and slug it out and absolutely hate it and never want to do it again, or maybe they're going to be the kind of kid that likes to do that kind of thing. And they're going to get all kinds of feedback and accolades from other adults. Oh, wow, you did a half marathon, like it's amazing. And it's pretty cool. It's pretty awesome that somebody could do that. But it's a little bit misleading as to, what they should be focusing on, in that age group. So I do get a lot of parents saying, oh, my 12-year-old's thinking about running 10K, what do you think? Or my 12-year-old is thinking about doing a half marathon with me, what do you think? And I'll always try and bring them back to, if you're 13 or 14 and you want to do one 10K a year just to go out and finish it, sure. Yeah. But to have it be a focal point, it's, if they want to be a performing athlete, then great. If they want to just do fitness and health and sport for life, then go and have different experiences if they love it, for sure.
Yeah. No, definitely, like this specialization too early, you almost hinted on it in terms of like there are overuse injuries early on. And there's this surgery, the Tommy John surgery in baseball players. It's on the elbow.
Mm-hmm.
And that used to just be like a professional thing. Now it's like very common in high school to have these overuse injuries from pitching 80 times in a game, right? And just pushing it and having it, too early of an age, having the focus be on winning and losing versus the experience. And also, if you specialize too early, I believe you're actually taking yourself out of the talent pool for other sports. Right? If you're specializing only at age 12 on baseball and that's all it's going to be through high school, did you take yourself out of being a great soccer player or something else that you didn't dabble in? Right. So do you see differences in sports? When we talk about athlete development, you're at the, at the federation level in triathlon. Is it very similar to cycling versus swimming? How do different sports kind of specialize earlier? Or are they all around age 16?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, we look at sports like gymnastics or figure skating where, kids are performing on the world stage, at 16, 17 years old. And, there's probably body changes that happen in your mid-late teens that maybe make it harder to have a hyper flexible back and do some of those crazy movements. And, there's that whole like a strength to weight ratio.
Sports.
That's right. And endurance, we all know that there are Ironman athletes who are absolutely killing it in their mid and late 30s and even 40 years old. And so it's a good reminder that there's no rush if your focus is on endurance sport to, go longer earlier, but to take your time. And, again, referring back to the journey with Brent, I had probably the great fortune of doing what became a longevity study on the work you do with an athlete in their teenage years and early 20s and how that plays out. And I remember recognizing when he was 20 that his gift was going to be endurance and ultra endurance. I mean, I remember giving him heck after a base run one day that he was running too fast and faster than some like Simon Whitfield and some of the other Olympians.
Right.
And then looking at his heart rate file and going, his heart rate was really low at that output, and he was just efficient, at that high-end aerobic pace. But then I also had the opportunity as a coach to walk him through the proper steps of development and not rush him into those longer, events. And, through his journey, I mean, he Junior Worlds, he went to 2 Olympic Games. He got to use some of those awesome mountain bike skills and stand on the podium at Xterra Worlds, and then when he did his first 70.3 finally, in his sort of mid-20s, he won. He won his first, 70.3 against some really great athletes, Chris McCormick, Chris Lieto, guys like that. And but I do, and when he did his first Ironman, he set the world record for the fastest ever debut Ironman. And I don't think that would have happened, and I don't think he would have had that level of success for him if we had rushed him into those longer distances at a younger age. And even now I'm seeing younger athletes coming into the longer events. And there's going to be some outliers in our sport who are going to be durable and keep going and keep improving. But I think we're also going to see some athletes who maybe have a couple of good years and fizzle too.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and also that jump in volume. Can you speak to kind of volume increases? Any kind of like words of advice there? What did you see? Are you jumping from 500 to 800 hours, a year in the span of 3 years, or what does this kind of look like? When do we hit the 1,000 hours a year mark, 10,000 hour rule and all this, but what kind of progression have you seen in a smart manner?
Maybe I'll word it a little bit differently. If I was going to simplify it, we just focus on, say, a distance runner. When you're in high school, you should be focused on running 400, 800, 1500, and going fast. Getting into racing environments where you can race a little bit more often, learn what it feels like to start on a start line, and you really learn to be efficient and push that high end threshold and anaerobic threshold at that age. As you're moving into late teenage years, if you're a distance runner, 5,000 is an appropriate next step. And then if you look at cross country, usually it's 5 to 8 kilometers, so 3 to 5 miles. And then when you get into sort of 20, 21, then you might start looking at the 10,000. If your physiology is geared that way, if you're a better 5,000 meter runner, you might continue to work those energy systems primarily. But you'll start adding on volume. So your longer runs will go from 40, 45 minutes when you're 16, 17, up to maybe 60 minutes when you're 17, 18. And when you get to 19, 20, you're looking at maybe 75 minutes. So you're starting to add that endurance foundation behind that good high-end threshold work. And when you get into your 21, 22, again, if you're geared a certain way, then you might start looking at running the half marathon. Which starts to entail 90 minutes and maybe up to a 2-hour run. But, you don't want to get into that kind of ultra endurance, 2-hour sort of endurance run work at too young of an age, for injury prevention, building up durability around, joints, tendons, and then also just making sure that you maximize those threshold development pathways so that your ceiling is higher when you get into the endurance element.
Yeah.
And I would say similarly with triathlon, you're looking at, even if you think about the sprint triathlon, we call it a sprint, it's still an hour race, and we still have like 16, 17-year-olds going out and doing an hour race, and cycling or even longer. I'm watching teenagers go out and do, enduro in mountain biking, and they're out on their bike for 4 hours, and
Right.
I remember my son trying his first enduro race when he was, 16 years old, and like he was gassed at the end. And I'm like, I don't think this is age appropriate. Like you're just out there too long.
Right.
You need to be going fast and learning how to go downhill really fast, and learning how to sprint and all that. So yeah, so age appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get into that. Your own personal life as a parent, having two kids. Your daughter just recently finished her first 70.3. She's 17.
She's 23.
Sorry, I'm way off. I was like, okay, I'm
No, that's
pushing it
good.
here.
I'd be a bad dad if I was putting my 17-year-old
Okay.
in a 70. Not a
Lesson
bad
learned.
dad, but you know what I'm saying. That's a little bit young though. No, so my son is 18. He just
Okay.
raced his first World Cup of downhill.
Okay.
Very proud of him.
Yeah.
Big experience, some big learning experience, more of a mental learning experience probably than a physical one.
Yeah. Big
And my
stage.
daughter's 23, and she just did her first 70.3 and did great. Won her age group and had just a really, really solid day and trained really hard for it. And she's come from running in college, going through all those developmental steps. And
Yeah.
if I hit rewind on her, she grew up playing soccer and doing musical theater, and then started running track in grade 11, and did well enough through the work that she did playing soccer and a couple of little kids triathlons here or there when she was younger, that she was able to join. She ran for McGill in Montreal, and she was able to be a part of the track and cross country team, and kept consulting dad on how do I cross train and stay fit and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we made sure not to overdo her and help her navigate that university running system, which sometimes, when a high schooler goes to university and runs, they get thrown to the wolves a little bit, and they're doing, adult women. I remember going to her first practices, and she's like, there's 25-year-old women on the team, and she's just out of high school, right? So yeah, yes, it was a big step. And then she came out and she was doing super sprint and sprint draft legal triathlons in the Quebec Cup, and she raced the World Championships, sprint draft legal as an age grouper in Montreal, and
Yeah.
and then she did her first Olympic distance last year, and then went back to sprints this year, did a couple of Olympic distances this year, and I said, well, you're 23, and she really wanted to try it, so we can cap your year off at the end of the year, and you can just go out and try a 70.3, see how you like it. It's not going to be the focus of your year, but we can make sure you get a couple 3-hour rides in, to get you ready. And the longest run she did was 90 minutes preparing for it, and couple of brick runs, and so it was enough training that she could get through it and be strong, but it was not training like I would have done with Lisa Bentley in the prime of her career. When
Right.
she was winning Ironmans and 70.3s, and because still somewhere for her to go as
Right.
far as building that endurance and yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Having somewhere to go yet still, peaking
Hmm.
too early, that specialization, have you seen
Hmm.
that where maybe parents are too enthusiastic, putting their kids into triathlon or whatever sport too early, and they
Hmm.
actually specialize too early, get fast too early, and maybe burn out?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, as a parent, your job is to drive your kid to practice.
Yeah.
You make sure they got the
Point.
stuff they need, the cleats, the baseball glove, the whatever, cheer for them and take them for an ice cream cone on the way home.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes the most important and vulnerable moment for a kid is in the car on the way home from the game or practice, where they're in this environment where there's nowhere for them to go to escape.
Yeah.
And then Coach Dad starts breaking it. You should have back checked harder. You should have done this. You should have done that. And it goes from I just played a game with my buddies and my coach gave me some feedback and it was an awesome experience and I'm learning as I go to you know there's like a father son or parent child relationship at stake here too. Parent pleasing and parents maybe starting to live a little bit vicariously through their kids
Yeah.
successes and so I always really like to highlight that to parents, like it's not challenging anybody on their parenting style at all. It's more just being really sensitive to the messaging you give your kids around the sport and with my kids, I always just, if they ask for help, I would give it to them. And I would say that I've observed over the years, having coached a lot of really high performing young kids, 90% of the time it's coming from the kid. Like the kid is asking for more help, they're asking for that equipment, they're asking for more specialized training. They want some help learning about strength or nutrition or whatever. It's rarely, the parent that's like, I shepherded my child down this pathway and therefore they're great. And when that does happen, often you get an adult performer who it's not super intrinsic. They're doing it for other reasons, because they've been pleasing their parent the whole way or whatever. So if a kid's good at sport and they pick their parents well and they're driven and they love it, they'll ask for more. And then
Yeah.
your job is just to support it within whatever means you have to support. I mean, because you also see crazy stories of parents remortgaging their house to send their
Yeah.
kid to hockey camp in the summer,
Yeah.
and you're like, maybe your kid should go to the beach and
I know.
hang out and or play baseball locally or something like that, or just yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean, what percentage of kids in hockey go on to play pro? How many go on to get a scholarship in college? We're talking five,
oh
2%,
yeah,
1%,
yeah,
less than that, right?
100%. And if you want to use triathlon too, I mean, I've seen so many talented kids come through and amazing athletes, but they don't quite get to that Olympic level. And then you got to say, okay, well, what was the outcome of that journey,
Right.
right?
Right.
It doesn't, because they don't make it to the Olympics doesn't mean it wasn't a valid journey. I mean, it's an
No.
incredible journey. It's about goal setting and work ethic and discipline and learning how to carry yourself. Finding a passion for sport and movement. Hopefully, something you carry on for your whole life. But you
Yeah.
hope that your kid comes out of that environment having had a really enriching, empowering, and sometimes challenging, and knocked down a few times, that they had to be resilient too, but they come out of that sport as a stronger, young person who is better equipped, to deal with the world and also has a love for sport and health and fitness, which they're going to carry on and pass on to their kids one day too. That's for
Yeah.
me
Lifelong.
when I think about my kids, they both have gravitated towards high performance sport. They've both found it in their own ways. My son, as I mentioned, he just did his first World Cup of downhill. And one day I sat down and wrote down all the sports that he did, like coach season, for a karate belt, for a diving or whatever, and he
Yeah.
had been in 18 different coach sports.
Awesome.
And and we also just kept trying stuff,
Yeah.
soccer, cross country, swimming, all of it. Nothing ever really stuck. He did it for a while, and he's like, oh, that's not my thing. And then amazingly, he found parkour, which
Mm.
is like jumping, and then he found hip hop dance, and he loved that. And he was, it was like his first
Um,
competitive experience was like competing with a team in hip hop, and he was really good, and he loved it. And then we'd always tinkered on the mountain bike, and then he found a group of boys, when he was 14, who were on this mountain bike club, and they would go out and they'd ride the trails, and and he fell in love with it. But he found his people. It was social. He had a group to go train with. It wasn't grinding hills with dad or something and getting instructions from dad. It's like he found that, and then when he got to age 16, he had to choose between hip hop and mountain biking because the
yeah.
competitions were on the same weekends, and he decided that's what he loved more. And so that was his pathway, and he raced regionally, he raced locally. He asked about strength training, he asked about nutrition. He broke dad's bank a few times on bikes and broken equipment, that's
Yeah,
for
of
sure.
course, that's
But
part of parenting. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you just do the best you can to get him the stuff that he needs, so he can, and also, like, do you really need the $400 or $500 shock yet? Do you
Yeah,
really need the carbon this or whatever? And just sort of doing gut checks and keeping it real, and
yeah,
giving him
definitely.
the equipment he needs at an appropriate pace too. So yeah,
Yeah,
so
being,
yeah,
creating the lifelong athlete should be the primary goal, right? And I think about my own
absolutely.
experience in cycling. I was gung ho
Mm,
from age 12. It's like all I wanted to do,
yeah,
like race. I just wanted to race. And I was last in my very first race, but I
yeah,
fell in love with it. I was last
yeah,
place, but like, this is it.
yeah,
And but then my parents, they did hold it back. They did say in middle school you need to do a school sport. So I did
yeah,
basketball, football, track, but I would train on the bike like before and after practice, or early
sure,
in the morning I'd get on the bike and then do football practice after school. And when I got to high school, I was like, I just want to do the bike. And so they allowed me to do single sport, but they got me a coach. And later on, my dad told me, he told this, my first coach, I just want Dirk to be in love with the bike for the rest of his life.
yeah,
He wasn't about the results. And my
yeah,
father, so my father was a coach.
yeah.
So
He
he
was a good
made
one.
sure to get me another coach, not himself, right? And he stayed out of that training realm.
Hmm.
He would answer questions, when I had them, but I had another coach. Um, and so I'm grateful for that. I obviously was not the fastest junior, but somehow was able to go pro. And I was in Europe for 5 years and raced pro for 12 years and made
Hmm.
a career out of it. But I wasn't
Hmm.
the fastest at the beginning, but the passion
Hmm.
was there. So somehow I saw a lot of kids that came and went, and they were so much faster than me, but they just fizzled out really quickly.
Yeah.
Um, and then I read about like other countries and the way they go about youth development, and I've recently read about Norway, and like obviously
Mm-hmm.
Norway is like this huge buzz in triathlon and everything else these days, it seems like. But in
Hmm.
Beijing, okay, granted, winter sport, Norway is a cold country, but they had the number one medal count of like 48 medals, and
Hmm.
the U.S. had half of that. They
Hmm.
have a population the size of Detroit, and they
Yeah.
produce 47 medals in the Winter Olympics. And when you dig into it, you see that up through age 13, like it truly is about participation. I hate that word participation award, but they
Hmm.
don't keep score. There's no winners, losers. There's really no
Hmm.
timing. And they open up all sports for free. It's government funded. but they
Hmm.
don't keep score.
Yeah.
And it's not about winning, losing. It's about the process and just having, literally, number one is having fun. And so they keep athletes longer,
Hmm.
seems, and they can produce better results because of that range that they build early on. So I thought that was fascinating. Have you seen
Because
anything?
they're building a bigger talent pool essentially.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
looking at it from a high performance perspective. You've got more kids participating in in sports. And you think about like football in the U.S. and like there's a lot of kids that play football.
Yeah.
So some really
Right.
good football players are going to come out of that kind of a talent pool. And but what I love about that example again is it's the focus on the long-term well-being and health and wellness of your society essentially by really making sure that young people have a positive experience around sport. You think about a kid, if they do one kids triathlon when they're 10 or 11, they're always going to identify a little bit with being, I'm a triathlete. I know
Hmm.
what that is. So when they're 35 or 40 or whatever, and they're like, oh, I really need to pick something up for fitness, the idea of doing a triathlon is going to be in their realm, in their sort of in their imagination because
Yeah.
they've experienced it before. Just like if you played a little bit of soccer, you might go join an adult soccer league when you're a little bit older because you've had that experience. And on the flip side too, as a high performing cyclist, going later into life, if you tried some other things, like you could go and play pickup basketball or whatever later on in life.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
lifetime, yeah, we call it lifestyle fitness. Always being fit and strong enough and having a versatile skill set enough that I could ramp up and go do a half Ironman in 6 8 weeks if that's what I wanted to do. I could also take up that invitation to go hike, that mountain or
Mhm.
you know,
Give
go,
a
go,
baseline.
go, yeah, or go skiing, on some, epic ski trip. I have a buddy who wants to go hella skiing. All right, well, I better get to the mountain a few times and polish up, but I'm generally coordinated enough that I can go and do that kind of fit enough that I can endure, a couple of days of that. So yeah, to me, that's the long game.
Yeah, and that plays into, aging well, right? And that's hopefully
Hmm.
the goal for all of us, and to stay in love and be active throughout our entire life. Um, if so, how about tips for coaches? You're a coach, you have a parent coming to you, they
Hmm.
want you to coach their. I mean, if we say like, a 14-year-old versus an 18-year-old, are there
Yeah,
focus? Is there different focus for those two kind of age groups?
for sure. I mean, I think first and foremost, the coach is responsible for creating the environment and the culture of where these young people in essentially you've been entrusted to
Right.
guide. I mean, they talk about the most important people in a young person's life. It's their parents, and then it's their coach, and then it's their teacher in that order. And so
Right.
that's the kind of significance of the role that you're playing with these young people have been entrusted to you. So thinking about the culture and the environment that you're creating, and that means, you know, having an element of fun, having an element of playfulness, especially when they're younger,
Yeah.
making sure that there's an opportunity for it to be social when they're younger, really having a strong focus on skill development, but creating games out of it as opposed to it being repetition and grind, repetition and grind, repetition and grind.
Yeah.
There's a really great youth development coach in Victoria named Kelly Guest, and my daughter was lucky enough to train with him when she was younger. And they would go and run intervals in the trails, and then they would play ultimate for a while,
Oh,
and then
nice.
they would run a few more intervals, and then they would play ultimate, right? And as a
Yeah.
12 or 13-year-old who's learning to train, and they would really look forward to that practice, because they were still going to get a good workout, but that wasn't the whole focal point. The focal point was they're going to see their friends there, and there was going to be an element of fun. lots of drills, lots of strides, lots of activations, so lots of skill learning.
Yeah.
He would have races, putting your helmet on and off and getting on and off your bike and that kind of thing too. So
Yeah.
really specific skill development, but wrapping it in a context of game playing and fun. And that's up to 14, 15 years old. That's totally appropriate. And then as you get older, then obviously you're in the learn to train phase of your learn to train, learn to race, learn to win journey as a performing athlete. So
Right.
then it's teaching them how to manage practices and that, but still being really conscious of I call it the long game. When you're thinking about an athlete, and that's not just performance. I mean, that's the long game of human development, and it's not how you're going to drill down and kick their butt today, and it's the messaging that you're giving them today that they're going to absorb and internalize and carry with them later in their athletic career, even as high performers. It's going to shape their journey and it's going to impact their performance. A happy athlete is a fast athlete. So if you're creating an environment of joy and playfulness alongside work ethic, determination, structure, respect for your group, the kind of energy you bring, then you've got it.
Yeah. Well, I think about it as a coach also, like there is the star athlete and there's
Mm-hmm.
everybody else, but not playing the favorites, if you will, kind of treating everyone equal, giving everybody their own due positive feedback, right? And not just focusing on the star athlete, because they all can be champions potentially down the road, right? They're all equals in that regard. They all have potential, but they're not all gonna make it to that championship elite level. And so exiting this sport with that self-confidence and the way of like dealing with others and taking on challenges, right? And building up that confidence, I think in the end.
Totally, totally. No, it's valuing and validating all the individuals who are in your group, and it's really easy. You might be the star of your group, but there's always a bigger pond and bigger fish.
Yeah, right,
There's
right.
always
Always.
some kid, across the country or in Europe or
There's only
whatever.
one world champion. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So it's and not losing perspective too, because sometimes I've been part of Olympic journeys and Olympic teams where you've got these athletes who have qualified for the Olympics, and in some ways they're being viewed as lesser than the medal potential athlete, and you're like, this is an incredible athlete who's dedicated their life to getting to this level of one of only 55 triathletes on that start line, from the
Yeah.
entire planet, and that is an incredible accomplishment, and and the kid who gets to race for their national team, or maybe gets one start in that WTS level, like that's an incredible life achievement to get to that level. So we're always thinking about how can we develop future world champions and future Olympians, and that's what drives the high performance mindset. That's what athletes are hungry for too. How good can I be?
Yeah.
So definitely, that's I want to validate that as well too. Like if they're hungry to get faster and they want to win stuff, like your role as a coach for that mid 20s athlete is to give them the tools to succeed, and teach them how to be determined and confident and make good decisions out there, and see their competitors as other human beings as well. this,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. And it's funny coming from founder of Training Peaks, but de-emphasizing the data, right? It's more about the process than the outcome.
yeah,
Okay, they might be on Training Peaks at age 15, but hey, let's not worry about power to weight ratio yet. It's like, what's the
mm,
process of maybe tomorrow's workout? Like preparing for tomorrow's workout, for example, might be more the focus than
mhm.
your normalized power.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost an overused term now, but it's a holistic approach. It's
Right.
thinking about what mental skills, what kind of mental fortitude are you developing? Are you building up the kid's self-esteem? Because if you've got a thoroughbred, exceptional athlete and they have paper thin self-esteem, like they're never going to realize their potential. And I've working with Federation, I've seen kids come through who had the goods, hands down had the goods. And you see it in
Mhm.
every professional sport. The highly touted draft pick who just never comes to fruition at the professional level. And,
Right.
a lot of times that's just, they just don't have the complete toolkit to make
Hmm.
that happen.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Also, from the perspective of a coach, you mentioned thoroughbred. Like if you have a squad, you do have the thoroughbred, but realizing you're not setting everybody's pace zones off of that thoroughbred. We all
yeah,
have our own
yeah,
individual like paces, if you will,
yeah.
and that's difficult. That would be difficult to manage if you do have the star athlete. We're going to go out and do these intervals, but somehow to
Mm,
explain to the group that you are at different paces, right?
yeah,
It's hard to take it if you're in the third or fourth group,
yeah.
40 seconds behind the leader.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. And I could give you 100 examples. I mean, I remember coaching a high performance camp in Australia, and I had one young woman who was really like getting down on herself because she wasn't keeping up. You know,
Yeah.
and I kept saying, these are really good athletes you're training with, and one of the athletes went on to be ITU world number one. Another one went on and won a couple of World Cups that year and ended up winning World Championship medals 3 years in a row. And this particular young woman went and raced her first ITU, they call it Continental Cup of the year,
Mm-hmm.
and won. you know,
Yeah.
but she lost perspective on how well
Right.
she was doing because she was getting gapped on every single workout. So in some ways, you're trying to reframe it as look at the opportunity you have here. You've got the standard and level right there. So you could say, hey, I was only 5 seconds, a kilometer, or a mile behind that incredible athlete every interval, and if I think about that rationally, that's going to put me in the mix at a world level. But the other thing, I would say is swimming is a great example. If you're a triathlon coach running swim practices, I'll always, if I'm observing coaches, I'll see, are their eyes on all the swimmers or are their eyes on the star athlete the entire practice?
Right.
And it's you're potentially not only doing a disservice to the other athletes, but you might be letting some future talent slip through the cracks because everything is driven towards that one current high performer. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Any final thoughts for parents here? Tips on helping their kids out, getting them started in the right direction, or last
well,
minute thoughts?
yeah, I mean, I think just as a parent, if you're encouraging your kids to be active and get into sport, you're already doing an awesome job as a parent, and trying to share a love of sport. Just keeping the messaging around cheering and let the coaches do the coaching, and you know give your kid a big hug after the game, whether they won by 5 or they lost by 5, and then you know and then move on to the next topic.
Exactly.
Let's go home and watch a Disney movie or whatever it
I know
is.
you got to swallow your pride as a parent.
Yeah,
And I myself, my daughter, I'm a cyclist. She did her first bike race at like age 6. She said
yeah,
she would never ever do another bike race because she was the only girl. And like
yeah.
she never did another bike race, but she discovered lacrosse and volleyball and other things along the way. So I just had to
Yeah.
swallow my pride, and that's fine. That's fine. I understand.
Dirk. I mean, when my son started hip hop dancing, I mean, he didn't get that from me. But then you're like, all of a sudden you're in this whole world of like
Yeah,
learning about something completely different. I'm
I
like,
know.
this is really cool. And now I didn't know what isolations were
Isn't it
before,
in
but
the
I do
Olympics?
now. Yeah, I think breakdancing is coming
Oh,
into
break.
the Olympics. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I think I just learned that yesterday, actually. So I'm like, that's amazing, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyways, it's you can learn so much about yourself as a parent just by observing your kids and being a part of their journey and
Let
just
them decide their path, right? And follow along. That's support them and let them decide their own path.
and
Maybe.
I've always said that if my kids just grow up being loving fitness and taking care of themselves, that's mission accomplished as a parent.
Yeah.
they both self-selected into high performance sport, and I'm just trying to find people to help
Sometimes the
them,
genes are there.
and yeah, I don't, yeah, maybe they overcame the genes. I don't know. Anyway, it's fun to cheer for them for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for all the great feedback, advice, and good luck to all the parents and coaches out there developing the next generation of champions and non-champions as well.
Absolutely, 100%.
Thanks, Lance.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Training Peaks Coachcast. Visit trainingpeaks.com for more training and coaching resources.